Good morning, everyone. My name is Alex Lovell, and I'm from the Refugee, Resettlement Secretariat in the Ministry of Citizenship and Immigration in the Government of Ontario. Today's presentation is going to be providing a fairly high-level description of the measurement framework that we've developed. It's in the early phase of implementation, and we're hoping that this will provide insights to help with understanding how to improve pathways for integration for newcomers, but particularly for refugees. I think the main takeaway that I want to leave in today's conversation is that the amount of data being collected, and many of your organizations, of course, are providing data on a regular basis, is becoming a bit of a challenge for many folks, not just in terms of the service side, but for Canadians in general. And so we're trying to leverage the data that is already being collected, and so we're using a linked data approach. And I think this is something that is true for what's happening at the federal level and happening with other governments as well. But I think it's also something for us to sort of all think about collectively, because there are lots of benefits in terms of using linked data, for example, tax file records and educational records, but there are gaps in terms of what's available. So hopefully we can come up with a strategic way of just making requests for information from the public in terms of newcomers or in terms of the organizations that are providing services in a very strategic way, and take advantage of what data is already collected. Okay, so I'll provide a bit of context. As you all are aware, in the last 2 years or so, the country has really went beyond what has been happening in I guess, the last 10 to 15 years in terms of resettling refugees, with our response to supporting resettlement of Syrian refugees. And Ontario was one of the key landing and destinations for Syrian refugees, and of course for refugees more generally. This required government at all levels to work together, the nonprofit sector, and of course communities. When you look, for example, at the private sponsorship, a lot of communities came together and supported resettlement. This also provided a bit of an opportunity for the researcher in terms of thinking about what this all meant for our system, our resettlement system, because having such a large number of folks come to the country in a short span of time was a very unique opportunity to get an understanding of how the system would respond to that need, and what are some of the things that could be improved. So I think that it's probably fair to say that all levels of government have been very focused on trying to understand what the outcomes are in order to make improvements in terms of policy moving forward. And the Secretariat's goal is really to inform policy, with one of our pieces being implementing a measurement framework. So I'll take a moment and talk a bit more about the Refugee Resettlement Secretariat at the Ministry of Citizenship and Immigration. We are a collective that have been sort of mandated to work on understanding the integration issues and providing policy advice to government, to the Government of Ontario, regarding refugee resettlement. And we have four areas of focus. The first is around removing barriers. So we're engaging with folks in our government, different ministries, and also other levels of government, the community sector and so on, to identify and to try to address barriers for resettlement. And this is basically policy work, policy action. That also corresponds with engaging with folks across government. As you probably all know, government is huge, and so sometimes just getting folks to actually have the same perspective on things is very challenging. So one of our roles is to get folks in the room and have conversations about what the issues are facing refugees and how it may be implicated in the work that their ministry is doing or their particular policy shop. We're also developing a strategic communication, developing a communication strategy, which is really meant to address and to engage the Canadian public around issues facing refugees, around refugee resettlement, and addressing some of the issues that I think have been on the sort of, in terms of people's what people have been thinking about, populism, anti-immigrant sentiment, and some of the other issues that we see surfacing in the last few years. So the communication strategy is meant to address that and engaging with folks across government and in the community sector to find out how best to do that, because it's a very challenging thing. It's almost like the question that drives this is, what is the best way to engage the Canadian public to develop a better understanding of the issues facing refugees and develop a shared responsibility and political will around that. And the fourth component, which is really my area of focus, is our performance management, which is essentially an outcome evaluation that includes 3 component features, and I'll talk more about that. So, the case for good measurement. I don't think I have to spend much time making this case, but we all have heard before, some of the challenges with really getting a sense of what are the outcomes that come out of efforts at the community level or in government, and we're all committed to seeing that the work that we're doing is actually having the effect that we hope for. So the case for measurement is essentially the case for reflecting on the work that we do and making sure that it has the impact as intended. But there are current challenges to doing this work, and in the case of refugees, in the case of newcomers, this challenge is specifically acute. For example, we don't know much about the socioeconomic situation of folks before they come into the country. So if you're thinking about doing an outcome evaluation, you'd want to have a bit of that information. There are pieces of information here and there. The landing file provides a bit of information on that, but that's a gap, right? So, and I think for academics, there's always been, at least in recent years, a really strong effort to try to rebuild that pre-migration piece in terms of understanding what that means for settlement and what that means for the longer term outcomes in Canada. But I'm just flagging that as one of the gaps. There's also a gap in terms of having sort of just a rigorous monitoring system in place. Folks, when they come here, they are using services like others where there are different databases collecting information. They might be surveyed at different points in time. Some of the information does come together in terms of systems like iCare, for example, but it doesn't include everything. So there's a real gap in terms of understanding what service usage looks like across the province. But yeah, if we look at what's available, for example, the census, we can only see cross-sections of situation, and that is not exactly evaluative in nature. We want to be able to look at what's happening for folks over a course of time, and so the most appropriate way is to be doing longitudinal research. Longitudinal research, as done traditionally in Canada, has been very, very expensive. The Longitudinal Survey of Immigrants to Canada, which was probably the key piece that a lot of academics have turned to from a few years ago, had 3 waves, and by the 3rd wave you start to see attrition. It's a fairly expensive thing to do. So ideally the longitudinal approach is where you go, but it's hard to do. And I think that some of the innovation in terms of linked data is actually allowing us to be able to do that work. So I'll just pause here to talk a little bit about sort of some of the different approaches that are applied in terms of evaluation and what the benefits are and the limitations. So in some cases, you might just be interested in knowing one outcome. So the employment outcome is probably one that's on everyone's mind, or becomes one that I guess gets a lot of media attention. So you could look at one data point around that and ideally link it to information about newcomers. So in the census, you could look, for example, what the unemployment rate is for a newcomer group, right? In some cases, this can be poor data quality or just not data that you can actually track over time, which is one of the challenges. And it doesn't provide the holistic approach. I think that most people would very quickly look at that result and start to ask other questions, because it actually raises more questions than it answers. And you start to want to know things about their education or about family composition and those sorts of things. So linking is key. There's provincial program data, for example, collected by the various providers of services. So that may not be focused on outcomes. Historically, those types of data have been focused more on outputs, numbers of folks served and so on, which is important, of course, but the outcomes piece is always missing. And then there's the piece in terms of the perspective of the folks responding. So when you ask service providers what outcomes are for the clients they serve, they might have a different answer than if you're asking directly the clients. And so it's about trying to have those multiple perspectives. There's other data sources, for example, provincial administrative data sets. Sometimes those data sets can be pretty messy. They don't include some of the socio-demographic information we're all interested in. So there's sort of gaps there as well. Qualitative inquiry, which is what in Canada has been kind of the cornerstone of a lot of settlement research because of the lack of data. Focus group studies, even some of the convenience-based questionnaire survey studies. Those capture information, but again, there's always questions about how reliable that information is. And then mixed method studies, which, it's not really uniquely a different type per se, but various studies like that are done in Canada as well. And then there's been new efforts to collect data that are helpful, but I think that when you look at trends and behaviors in terms of responding to surveys, for example, response rates, trying to get a better sense of who's not responding, which is always a very challenging thing to do, you realize that that's not necessarily the most promising avenue for the future of research on settlement and integration. So we have tried to address this in 3 ways in our evaluation framework. The cornerstone of our evaluation is a linked data longitudinal study, which is built on the IMDb. And if you're familiar, that's essentially the landing file attached to tax records. But there are other linkages that are possible as well, and we've been exploring those. So we're in an early kind of phase there. We don't have results, for example, but the goal is to have administrative data linked at a population level, so we know all the folks that came in, and then being able to see what their tax records look like, their educational, whether they're in school and so on, health records and all of those pieces. So that's one of the key focus. Then we do a qualitative component where we speak with refugees in groups, individually, however best meets the needs of the folks that we're asking for insights from. And we also do a similar thing with service providers, which is done through a survey. All of those 3 components contribute to our study. Our approach is aligned to, in terms of what we're looking at, the indicators, the way we structure it's aligned to things happening internationally, happening also at the federal level and in terms of other ministries. So, of course, in government, there's a lot of effort placed on just getting a sense of what's being measured elsewhere and trying to make sure that we're doing something that makes sense with that. And we also reached out to a lot of subject matter experts. This is just a list of various folks that we consulted with to develop our framework, but it includes folks in government at all levels as well as in other sectors in academia. We have 4 key outcome domains that we are examining in our evaluation. These are basically buckets you can think of in terms of the various outcomes. One is integration, the other is health, education, and economics. When we break them down, we have identified outcomes across all of these areas. I won't read them, but essentially these are the goals that we're looking at, and our evaluation is examining with the best available data whether we're achieving those goals. We have 10 indicators that have been identified that we're tracking, and we're basically procuring data to be able to look at. These are examples of what the indicators look like. So, for example, being able to look at language data from various service files. We can also use census for some of that. Education, there's a post-secondary information system which collects information on enrollments in post-secondary in Canada. We'll be linking that, employment and so on, but you can see what's here. It includes socioeconomic and also sort of belonging and some of those other aspects that we're all interested in. And This is where I'm going to end, but I do hope that folks can come over during the day. If you see me and you want to ask more questions, I'll let you know. As I mentioned, we're in a very early phase in the implementation, but the point is that we will be able to develop insights that will inform policy and also will be shared with the public. We're starting to think about how that will look in terms of both the sharing of data as we can and sharing of results, and also sharing other research that we think really falls within our area. So we're pulling together research from others and developing summaries and fact sheets and that sort of thing that we'll share with the public. So thank you.